Look at the calendar, we're fast approaching towards the summer vacation. And of course, everyone is looking forward to traveling around the world. Perhaps not for the sitting US President Donald Trump, not only that he's dealing or he's really in the midst of the whole political chaos, domestically and also internationally. But on the other hand, people keep on asking the question, what is Donald Trump trying to accomplish before the midterm election takes place? Now, paying a closer attention to the media report, on May 1st of this year, President Trump signed another executive order imposing secondary sanctions on targeting companies, many of them foreign, from doing businesses with the citizens or even the government in Cuba. And keep in mind, people are still questioning the goal of the war between US and Iran, and also what about the war in Ukraine? In addition to all of that, how can Trump afford to put something else seem totally irrelevant to the foreign policy about Cuba at this moment? And what about the strategy that putting things on the plate, but meanwhile shifting attention to someone else within the Trump administration? And how about Marco Rubio? And it looks like he's going to be the promising child for the Republican Party for 2028. And how do voters feel about that? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, Professor Kurt Wieland. Professor Wieland is a Mike Hawk Professor in Liberal Arts in the Department of Government at the University of Texas at Austin. He's the author of 5 other books, and one of his amazing books is called Democracy's Resilience to Populism Threat, Countering Global Alarmism. Well, Professor Wieland, and welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, again, Professor Wieland, such a fascinating topic. I have to say that every time when I have a conversation with you, not only it's about what's happening today, but in this global sense, really enlighten me and also our viewers. Now, let's get to the question right away. As I mentioned before in the intro, look at the war between US and Iran, and look at the war in Ukraine. And in addition to all the ambiguities, Trump continued to put his major interest for the nation of Cuba. And on May 1st, he continued to post what we called a secondary sanctions among the companies and also among the business holders that were willing to do a business with the Cuban government. I guess the fundamental question everyone is asking today, even though I know you're not a mind reader for Trump, but we still want to know, Professor Wieland, why is Trump still so resilient about Cuba, and what is the goal he's trying to accomplish? Is it creating additional political chaos, noises, a distraction from what's happening right now, or he has something else in mind? Your thoughts?
So President Trump has been concerned about Cuba for a long time. I mean, even his first government, there was this idea of the axis of evil when John Bolton was national security advisor, and Cuba was clearly part of that. And of course, that goes back to Cuba for more than 60 years being a thorn in the side of the United States. And I think President Trump would like to be the one who defeats that long-standing challenge, who brings Cuba to heel, who liberates the island. He has always had strong support from the exiled Cuban community, especially in Florida, and plays to them. But I think it's also that effort to use American power to defeat that challenge and subdue Cuba. As you indicate, at this very moment, there's probably also a diversionary motive, because President Trump got himself into this terrible mess in the Persian Gulf, where Iran doesn't give in, and Iran is demonstrating an amazing capacity to withstand tremendous American pressure, to hit back in this asymmetrical form of warfare, and to simply string along President Trump, who is eager, if not in strong need of having an end to that war and a ceasefire for domestic political reasons. You know, the closing of the Strait of Hormuz is driving up the oil price, driving up inflation, further lowering Republican chances in the midterm elections. And so diverting attention from that by focusing on Cuba, which is weaker enemy of the United States that really can't hit back very easily would be maneuvering himself in a position of claiming a victory that might distract people's attention from the Middle East. Although, of course, when you think about it, the pressure on Cuba has been going on for months. The cutoff of oil supplies to the island started with President Trump's capture of President Maduro of Venezuela, the pressure on Mexico not to supply oil to Cuba. And so the island has been in very dire straits, and in some sense surprising that they haven't given in to the very strong US pressure so far. And so that is what accounts for, the escalation with these secondary sanctions that you mentioned, the indictment of the former president, Raul Castro. So the United States is trying to tighten the thumb screws on the island and finally pushing them to concede and make a deal, which means essentially giving in to American demands.
Professor Whelan, let's talk about economic sanction for a bit. Again, when we look at the initial war between US and Iran, of course, there's no denying that the US government have actively placed sanctions upon Iran. I mean, again, we can trace it all the way back to the Bush administration and Obama administration, all the way to second term of Donald Trump. But meanwhile, again, based on the report, it says the current Trump administration will keep pushing economic sanctions to try to strangle the regime in Havana in a slow motion constriction. Professor Whelan, you are the expert. But based on the reality, and we know that today countries such as Iran, countries such as Cuba, are not stranger to political or economic sanctions, particularly from the West. But if we look a little bit deeper, somehow the government has not responded strongly, and despite the political rhetoric or despite the sanction. So in other words, people really start to question the effectiveness of those sanctions upon Cuban government or upon Cuba. And even though, again, look at the report, it's one senior official from the Cuban government. It just says, you can play all the sanctions, but Cuba, it's not Iran. And the president is no rush to respond at this moment. So again, based on your understanding, based on your analysis, Professor Whelan, how do we understand the effectiveness of sanctions upon the Cuban government or the country at this moment, even though we know this country is already in turmoil? Your thoughts?
I think the effectiveness on sanctions on Cuba is much higher than on Iran because, Cuba is essentially cut off from the international system. The United States essentially has a blockade. When Russia tried to bail them out with a supply of oil, the United States let one tanker in and that was it. And so Cuba really is at risk of economic strangulation, energy, and the secondary sanctions that you mentioned are essentially designed to deter other countries from doing any economic relations with Cuba. And so, I think the sanctions really bite and hurt. The Cuban regime is in very dire straits. Their capacity for repression, which they demonstrated when protests erupted in 2021, has so far prevented the regime from suffering a mass uprising. But at some point or other, when the cuts in energy, the tremendous hardship that that imposes on the Cuban people, there might really be very strong pressure on them. And so I do not think that they will be able to resist for very long. And I don't think that the United States will feel compelled to, for example, resort to military action. I think sooner or later Cuba will have to give in. This is like a medieval siege of a castle, and it might take 3 months, or it might take 6 months, or it might take a year, but there's no escape for the Cuban regime from this tremendously strong and ever-tightening US pressure. And I think that's very different from Iran, that has other ways of evading sanctions and has supporters that can somehow or other bail them out. The Cuban regime is isolated in that sense at the mercy of the US. Now, They, of course, know that the survival of the regime is at stake, much more than in Venezuela, because in Venezuela, President Trump could get Maduro and then push the second in command, Delcy Rodriguez, into playing the US game by opening up the country to US economic interests. And so that was what the United States wanted there. The US, President Trump does not really pursue regime change in Venezuela, but especially you mentioned the role of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is of exile Cuban descent. There, the potential goal is much farther reaching because the exile Cuban community wants to get rid of the communist regime in Cuba. So just, even if Raul Castro were captured by the US or extradited or whatever, that would still keep the power structure in place. And whereas that is acceptable and amenable to Trump in the Venezuelan case, I think that would be much harder to sell not only to Marco Rubio, but also to the exile Cuban community, which is eager, after 65 years, finally to take back the island, reclaim property, celebrate defeat over a regime that brutally expelled their relatives from the island 65, 60 years ago. And so I think the Cuban case is much more complicated because the goals of different players are much more deep-reaching than in the Venezuelan case that doesn't have nearly the same salience as Cuba for the US.
Professor Whelan, let's talk about the sitting Secretary of the State, Marco Rubio, for a second. Again, based on what I'm reading right now, that President Trump, it's more likely to shift the task to Marco Rubio, and given his Cuban background and also, of course, his senior position under the Trump administration. But meanwhile, if we pay closer attention to the recent Senate hearing between Marco Rubio and the Foreign Affairs Committee, of course, it was heated. The conversations did not really go very well, especially regarding the strategy for Iran or even the solution for Iran at the first place. But other experts believe that Trump is also very much interested, you kind of allude into the content, is U.S. military action. We know that this is not a single decision that the president can make at this moment, because we learned this looking at the war between U.S. and Iran at this moment. So, Professor Whelan, from your perspective, how do we understand this possibility of involving U.S. military action in order to send a warning to Cuba or strong messages to Cuba, or even Trump's desire to, again, not regime change, but we're looking for something that to the Cuban government at this moment. So again, number one, the question is, how reliable is Marco Rubio at this moment to take over the task? And number two, what about this military action? Because again, there are so many international businesses are still locating in Cuba, and they're terrified if there were military involved, or even perhaps someone like Marco Rubio, who's a straight shooter, could get started. Your thoughts?
So, first of all, you're breaking up with the sound. So I only heard part of your question, so I might not be on target in my response. So, I doubt that military action on Cuba is very likely, because the Venezuelan regime was very personalistic. So here you can capture Maduro, the number two will then play ball with the United States. The Cuban regime is of a very different nature. It's much more well integrated, much more ideological, much more organized. So just doing a commando raid and capturing one person wouldn't do the job. Second, in the Cuban case, such a commando raid would be much more high risk. In the Venezuelan case, there's always been the kind of rumor that this was partly pre-negotiated with Delcy Rodriguez because the US commando raid went so smoothly until the very end, and it's kind of suspicious. And it wouldn't be the case in Cuba. They wouldn't just hand over Raul Castro. So if that is the case, the other type of military action would be, you could do kind of bluffing and getting a few aircraft carriers in front of the island, but real military action would mean either specific strikes or an invasion. And I think that is unlikely. An invasion would be much too high profile and high risk and get Donald Trump into the nation building that he has promised not to do. And I'm not sure that strikes would do the job either. So I would not regard the risk of military action in Cuba as very high at all. I think this is more bluffing, pushing, and essentially the effort to use economic pressure and stringent economic strangulation to get the Cuban regime to make some kind of deal. How that would work out, and as I mentioned, I think it's a much more complicated case, partly because it's not only the US government that would have interests in Cuba, like opening for investment and these kinds of things, but the exiled Cuban community, many of whom want a restitution of property taken away by Fidel Castro. And that is a very complicated issue and very, very difficult for the Cuban regime to agree to. And so the complexity, the depth of change that might be in store for Cuba, or that Trump might want to impose on Cuba, really is an obstacle to that, the Cuban regime conceding defeat. So I wouldn't be surprised if the stalemate continued for a while, but I think eventually, given the really very strong US pressure, I think sooner or later the Cuban regime may have to make some kind of deal. And, maybe in some sense, Donald Trump, with the approach of the midterm, will also be more eager to get some deal and might lower his ambitions and his goals. And so you might see kind of a minimal deal that is face-saving for both sides. Doesn't really address a lot of the problems, but that's kind of the nature of Trumpian policymaking, right? A lot of vagueness, a lot of uncertainty. Nobody really knows what's going on. You get a little kind of that moment with photographers and can advertise a little success, and then what really happens and really revolves, typical chaotic populist style of policymaking will be figured out and will evolve along the road. So.
Well, again, Professor, I apologize for the disconnection during the conversation. I have two more questions before letting you go. No, let's talk about this rising populism and also look at the political rhetoric from Donald Trump at this moment. Recently, we'll say for the month of June, it's a fairly busy month. Not only we're looking at a lot of local elections took place, and also more elections are going to happen. For example, we'll look at the state of Montana, the state of Texas, and California all the way. But within the Republican Party, there seemed to be I want to be careful, the word it's mindset, or this political understanding is, if the candidate is supported by Donald Trump, the person is more likely to win the primaries. But if the person decided to go against the Trump, not only that he's going to lose the primaries, and also he could lose his reputation despite everything that he did or have done so far within the party. Professor, you are the expert, and of course you wrote many books on populism. So from your perspective, is Republican Party today really come down to Donald Trump's party? So in other words, how do we know that it's still with him, without him? The election results, or it's not even about the election results, it is political reputation are also on the line. What do you say to that?
So this is a very interesting issue that has two sides, because on the one hand, the primary defeat that Donald Trump helped to inflict on a number of his critics or former adversaries, like Bill Cassidy, like Thomas Massey, even on a loyal senator who voted with him 99% of the time, like John Cornyn in Texas. I mean, that shows the tremendous strength of Donald Trump inside the Republican Party due to his plebiscitarian command and control over the highly committed part of the Republican base. And of course, primary elections are low turnout. So if he can mobilize his hardcore followers, he can swing primary elections, as he has demonstrated, in a really kind of striking way recently, including booting out the state senators in Indiana that blocked the gerrymandering that tried to push forward in that state. So in that sense, it looks like total control of the Republican Party. Now, of course, you see in the Congress how this can also backfire, because now a number of the ousted Republicans are paying back and voting against him and tweeting against him and speaking against him. Even John Cornyn, Bill Cassidy, Thomas Massey. And so that means in some sense that Donald Trump is paying a price. What is more interesting and will obviously be much more important and remains to be seen is whether Donald Trump's, if you wish, brutal imposition of his retributive strategy on the Republican Party will also create a significant prize in the midterms, because these candidates like Paxton in Texas, I mean, the Democrats celebrated that he would win because they think he's much more defeatable, being so extremist and having so vast ballast and so many skeletons in the closet than a mainstream, reasonable senator like John Cornyn. And so, who knows whether Donald Trump now, victory, I imposed my hardcore, hardline candidates, and then that might, however, lead to defeat in the general election and might help to swing not only the House, but even the Senate in the Democrats' favor. And so Donald Trump, shot at his enemies, but in the end, he might have shot himself in the foot. And that, of course, the sinking fortunes of the Republican Party in the upcoming midterms is one reason why among Republicans in Congress, finally, there's a little waking up of independence, of blocking some of Donald Trump's most outrageous initiative, like this $1.8 billion weaponization fund of his megalomaniac ballroom and all these things. These are not major defeats that Donald Trump has suffered, but they're striking because before, the Republicans in Congress had shown such lack of spine. Amazing to, for example, for them to approve all Donald Trump's nominees, many of them with very, very low qualification and questionable records. And so far, what had been so striking is that Republicans hadn't stood up in their independent judgment at all, hadn't defended the prerogatives of Congress at all. And finally, we are seeing a little wake up. And so you see again the two sides of populism. On the one hand, Donald Trump, pushing his resolute demand for power concentration, for takeover of the Republican Party, apparently successful, but on the other hand, whoops, there's a price to pay right now in Congress, and then maybe a few months from now in the midterms. And so, which of course, if the midterms go bad, then Donald Trump's command over the Republican Party might quickly kind of crumble, because ultimately, you see that ultimately a lot of these politicians, they talk about principles and they talk about ideology, but what they are interested in is re-election. And when they see that Donald Trump is, the kiss of death and hinders the re-election, all this amazing control that it seems to have over the party might kind of flip around, might be a tipping point, and people, the old saying, the rats might want to jump from the sinking ship.
Well, Professor Wieland, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, that kind of part of the portion of the question that I asked you before. Let's talk about sitting Secretary of the State Marco Rubio for a second. Again, as we know, Marco Rubio's bio, the sons of Cuban immigrants to the U.S., and he clearly understands the strategies and also the effectiveness of pushing for regime change, such as Cuba. But meanwhile, people are still wondering whether someone like Marco Rubio is able to shoulder the responsibility of such task. And also, again, just within the political arena, Marco Rubio right now seems to be one of the promising children for Republican Party in 2028. So, Professor, again, the last question from your perspective, how do we assess Rubio's capabilities or skills to handling such task under the Trump administration? And what kind of message is Rubio sending out when we look at Cuba, when we look at regime change, or when we even just simply look at the next step under the Trump administration? Your final thoughts.
So when you think of it, Marco Rubio is one of the few pros on the Trump team. He's not an outsider. He has been a long-standing member of Congress, has played a very important role in the Senate for a long time. I mean, he was one of the leading figures in the effort at immigration reform in 2013, 14, and played a very important role there. So, I mean, he is an experienced player, skillful player, knows Congress, knows the machinery of government, by contrast to all the amateurs and incompetence that Donald Trump has chosen to appoint to his cabinet. So in that sense, he has a lot of what it would take to play a very important role. Ultimately, of course, his goals are divergent from Trump's, because Rubio, used to be a regime changer, really wanted to transform the world, bring more democracy, all these kinds of things, which is not what Donald Trump wants. He has, how should I say that, in the Venezuelan case, he has put these efforts on hold because Donald Trump doesn't want turmoil and trouble that a regime change would bring. In the Cuban case, it will be much more complicated for him, because this is his home base, this is his community, this is his political origin. And so I think that would make it complicated, is making it complicated for him to deal with the Cuban case, because there his deference to Trump, he couldn't just play this game of deference to Trump, and the goal conflict between the Secretary of State and the President might really come to the fore. So it's a difficult task for him. It's a very complicated thing for Secretary of State to push more ambitious goals than the president under whom he has to serve. And for Rubio to have, I think, much more of a strategy and long-term perspective compared to a populist like Trump, who has an exceedingly short attention span, who is chaotic like populists typically are. And so I think this will really be a test of Marco Rubio's skills. And, given that he is obviously a candidate for Trump's succession, and at this moment, probably the most high-profile candidate, because J.D. Vance has kind of disappeared and taken summer vacation, so I think the eyes will be on him, how he can navigate that Cuban issue that is really of great significance to him. So.
Well, again, Professor, right now, there's no definite tell about the next move from Trump. But one thing we do know, it's one more thing on the plate, and it's just going to be more chaotic and more stressful, not only for Trump, but also for the entire world. Well, ladies and gentlemen,
isn't it great for you, because you have, issues to cover? If there were stability and things went well, what would you cover, right? In many ways, you are interested in seeing all the ups and downs and backs and forths of a government that, produces news every day, every hour. So.
Well, that's right, Professor. I can't be more grateful about the content that the Trump administration has provided for all of us. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, such an honor to speak to Professor Kurt Wieland. Professor Wieland is the author of the amazing book, Democracy's Resilience to Populism's Threat, Countering Global Alarmism. Well, again, Professor, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we love to have you back on the show, and hope your summer vacation will go very well, and safe travel. Thank you so much for your time.